Welcome to the Scarlet Faithful podcast. I'm Aaron Brightman, wishing everyone a happy Thanksgiving. Appreciate everyone that's listened and watched over the last year plus, and wanted to focus on this episode for what I'm most thankful for Rutgers athletics, and that is being in the Big Ten. Obviously, it just changes everything. Our world would not be the same if Rutgers was not in the Big Ten. And there is so many reasons for excitement, for hope, for now, for the future, with Rutgers being in the Big Ten. And looking back on it, there's lots of people to give credit to for why Rutgers is in the Big Ten. Greg Schiano turning football around in the mid-2000s was certainly a huge part of it. It's going to be, I don't know, when you write his legacy, it probably would be line 2 or 3 of that first paragraph in terms of his impact and legacy at Rutgers. It doesn't really get talked about enough right now because obviously he's back and, he's continuing to build his legacy. But when it's all said and done, his part in terms of turning football around was a huge part of Rutgers getting into the Big Ten. It went back years, conversations. If you haven't seen Steve Pelletti's article on the entire process, he wrote it less than a year ago, just in terms of what the whole process of Rutgers getting into the Big Ten. You should definitely read it. It's a great article. But it's long been known about Joe Paterno and Penn State. There was the whole Big East fiasco in the early 80s, but Penn State, when they joined the Big Ten, did campaign a little bit for Rutgers. There were a lot of Rutgers Penn State ties. Dick Anderson, when he was coach, I remember 1984. He went 7-3. I went to many of those games as a kid. But at the end of the day, Bob Mulcahy, former athletic director, he deserves credit as well. But the process of actually making it happen, there's one person that deserves the most thanks, in my opinion, in terms of executing the deal, and that's Tim Pernetti, former Rutgers athletic director. I'm wearing my In Tim We Trust shirt. You see his number, old number 90, Pernetti on the back. Sorry if you're listening to this, but I'm wearing an old T-shirt in Tim We Trust for Tim Pernetti when he was athletic director at Rutgers. And he deserves thanks on this Thanksgiving, in my opinion, with Rutgers coming up on 10 years in the Big Ten and the job he really did. Jim Delaney, former Big Ten commissioner, talking about how it was, it was a 3-year process, and Pernetti obviously having connections in the TV world prior to Rutgers. He was also, in radio as well as a color analyst for Rutgers football. And but he worked in TV for a while. He had an expertise there. He had connections. He understood how to sell the value of Rutgers in New York City. And we know that the Big Ten added Rutgers primarily for that reason, for increasing revenue, for increasing value. And it's why when national writers completely miss the boat, like old friend Stuart Mandel, The Athletic, and writes it was the worst expansion move of all time, completely misses it, went way over his head, because when the Big Ten just signed the biggest deal, media rights deal in college sports history, that actually proves that adding Rutgers was arguably the best deal ever, best move in college expansion, because it ultimately resulted in a record deal for the Big Ten, and it's only going to go up. And while Rutgers did not succeed on the field in football for a large part of it, a big reason was because Schiano was gone, and now he's back and things are getting better. Basketball has risen up under Steve Peichel. A lot of the programs are getting better and or have won Big Ten titles, are in the top half of the conference. Look at, sports. We'll talk about that. But going back to Tim Pernetti, who, by the way, hired Meredith Civico, who just had field hockey, finished second in the Big Ten, lost in the first round of the NCAA tournament, but she's turned this program around. They were number 4 at one point. They were undefeated, 15-0. They went to the Elite Eight 2 years ago. They were number 1 in the country. He hired her long ago, and he also hired a coach by the name of Scott Goodell for wrestling, who we know has done wonders there, won national titles, made them into a national relevancy. One of the top 15 programs, bar none, the last 10 years. And there's some bad things that happened in Pernetti's tenure. Obviously, famously, infamously, the Mike Rice scandal. He hired Mike Rice. There was the controversy. Pernetti was very public about the fact that he wanted to terminate him when the video came out, when he discovered everything and was told no by compliance and all that. And then ultimately took the fall when everything went public and ESPN and all that blew up. And, it was extremely unfortunate. And then you had the Kyle Flood situation. Pernetti ultimately hiring Kyle Flood. Now, in fairness, he was under in the clock there, trying to save the recruiting class that at the time was the highest ranked ever, number 24, I believe. Tried to save the class, kept Flood. Respectfully, Greg Schiano did what was best for him and went to Tampa Bay, took half the staff with him. Pernetti was in a very difficult situation there. And those two hires were disastrous, or if Charles Barkley likes to say terrible, but given the circumstances, they're really bad. But the football situation was a difficult one. And basketball, you're looking back on that with the way he had to fire Fred Hill after the season when he wanted to before, and then it was the whole baseball, the bizarre scene with yelling at the umpires and all that. It was very late in the cycle, and Rutgers was not in a very good position there in the Big East at that time. So, yes, I excuses, whatnot. I'm trying to give context. You can't just say those were two terrible hires without understanding the difficult situations that they were in the hiring process. But all that being said, none of it comes close to negating. I don't think it's arguable. The biggest move in Rutgers University history in joining the Big Ten. The medical school merger was huge. But what the Big Ten has done for the university, not just athletics, but research-wise, and boosted the profile and the money coming in for research. And it's funny when all the academic types like to, complain about big time athletics at Rutgers. They never bring up the research side. They never bring up the benefits of that. Never. Huge, huge impact on the university. And then now Rutgers finally seeing record revenues come in for athletics. Yes, the athletic department's in the red. And that's years and years of, listen, and Jim Delaney's on the record saying, Rutgers was way behind. They were not prepared to join the Big Ten from an infrastructure standpoint, from a competitive standpoint, from a financial standpoint. They weren't. But Tim Pernetti made the right move, and he worked it for years. By the way, shout out to Janine Procuro. I hope I said her name right. She's the former CFO who, was a big part of working with Pernetti on this deal and getting Janine Procuro. Thank you for all your work. You don't get enough credit. But at the end of the day, Tim Pernetti got it done. And whether Rutgers floundered once they got in wasn't his fault. They went in with no plan. And part of that was when he was fired before they actually started in the Big Ten. And my ultimate kind of plea in all of this is that it's going to be the 10-year anniversary next year. Tim Pernetti played football at Rutgers. He was the color analyst for a while. He's a true loyal son. His wife played lacrosse at Rutgers. It's been almost 10 years. In some way, in some fashion, he needs to be publicly recognized by Rutgers. There needs to be some kind of reconciliation. He really hasn't been from what I understand, around. And I don't think he's been celebrated enough. A lot of the fans do get it and do celebrate him, but I think at the 10-year anniversary, it'll be time for Rutgers to make some kind of public reconciliation, whatever that may be. Is that have them at halftime, recognize them at halftime of a football game? There's lots of smarter, more creative people than me that can figure that out, but it's time. And on this Thanksgiving, I thought it was appropriate to recognize him. And because it really is true, if Rutgers wasn't in the Big Ten, things would be dramatically different. And I'm most thankful for Rutgers being in the Big Ten for anything when it comes to Rutgers right now. And you have to trace the roots. Again, many people were involved. Many people I'm not even naming that had a positive contribution to making it happen. And to anyone that had a hand in helping Rutgers get into the Big Ten, they have my ultimate respect and thanks. That being said, Tim Pernetti did the hard work to get Rutgers in. Stayed persistent. Perletti's article profiles how him and Percaro worked after hours and they kept everything, tight-lipped. They handled that, like state secrets. And they got it done. And the fact that Rutgers got in at the time, people were shocked. The national media, everybody. And, a lot of traditionalists are still pissed that Rutgers got in. Big Ten fan bases, national media. But Tim Pernetti ultimately got it done, and Rutgers is benefiting. And as I've said before, this first decade, we're not even scratching the surface on the potential of Rutgers in the Big Ten. We're starting to see signs now. But this second decade, they're going to have even more success. They're going to have even more financial gain. This is very early in the life cycle of being in the Big Ten. And it's only going to get better. And for that, thank you, Tim Pernetti, for all that you did. I hope that every Rutgers fan, whether you have a glass of wine on Thanksgiving, a shot, a beer, do a little extra swig of gravy, whatever you may do, dessert. When you do, think of Tim Pernetti and the respect and the thanks he deserves almost a decade later. May he never be forgotten for what he did. And I hope he's publicly recognized, reconciled, whatever it may be, for the 10-year anniversary of Rutgers in the Big Ten next year. I hope everyone who listens and watches this has a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you for everything in terms of the support of the Scarlet Faithful and my podcast. And thank you. Hope you have a happy Thanksgiving with your families. Rutgers is in the Big Ten. Thank you to everyone who did that. And thank you, Tim Pernetti.